Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening. Welcome to the 7th Ulrich virtual program that accompanies the Ulrich Artists and Youth Community Billboard Project. I'm Leslie Brothers, Director of the Ulrich Museum of Art, and I'm here with my colleagues, Jana Irwin, Head of Education, and Ksenia Gerstein, Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art. We have a wonderful program for you this evening, presenting Wichita's beloved photographer, Larry Schwarm. And the billboard featuring work is located at 4355 South K15 in Wichita. I hope that all of you have had a chance to see the 18 billboards currently on view around the city. If you haven't, you can find them in a slideshow on our website under current exhibitions. There you'll also map with locations, a link to the portal where all the artworks featured so far are identified and described, information on the Smartify app, and Jed Bodwin's curated playlists on Spotify, which are intended to enhance your billboard viewing experience. We thank our individual sponsors who are listed on the website. We thank our lead sponsors, Mike and Dee Michaelis and Emprise Bank, the Kansas Creative Arts Industries Commission, which awarded us funding from the National Endowment for the Arts, and Humanity Kansas. And before I pass the screen off to Ksenia, I want to tell you, if you're interested in receiving regular communications from the Ulrich, please join our free membership program. Just go to the Join Give dropdown on our website and fill out the very, very short form. So again, great to see you. And Ksenia, all yours.
Thanks, Leslie. And thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. Wonderful to see both familiar names and unfamiliar names in the list of attendees. I think we're going to have a great program. So I'm just going to say a few words to introduce tonight's speaker, Larry Schwarm, with whose work many of you are likely already familiar, but about which I personally, and I'm sure the rest of you as well, are really excited to learn more tonight. Larry was born and raised in Greensburg in central Kansas and received both his BFA and MFA from the University of Kansas. He, as Leslie pointed out, is now based in Wichita, where he was the Distinguished Professor of Photography in the School of Art, Design, and Creative Industries at WSU until his retirement last year. And prior to that, he taught photography for 25 years at Emporia State University. His work, as again, I imagine most of our guests know, has focused primarily on Kansas, where he has photographed both a variety of landscapes and people. His images have appeared in numerous publications nationwide, both in books and periodicals. And he has also published 2 books of his own photographs. On Fire came out in 2003, and that was about this really wonderful, powerful series of works in which he photographed controlled burns in the Flint Hills, and those are also the 3 pieces that appear on our Ulrich billboard. He also more recently published Kansas Farmers in 2018, and most of us who live here in Wichita probably remember that work from the great exhibition that the Wichita Art Museum did of that work. His work has also been shown in one-person exhibitions and group shows all around the country, including at the Smithsonian Museum of American Art in Washington, D.C. And his photographs are held in the collections of that museum, Duke University, Library of Congress, Los Angeles County Museum of Art, Nelson Atkins, Philadelphia Museum of Art, SF MoMA, the Wichita Art Museum, and last but certainly not least, the Ulrich Museum of Art. So tonight we're very lucky to have Larry speaking with us from his home/studio, both about his past work and about really current preoccupations, interests, exhibitions, and about his inspiration and process. So it's 6:05 right now. At around, we're gonna let Larry talk till about 6:45, at which point we'll open up the Q&A. At the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A box as well as a chat box. And you should feel free to put questions in there either during the talk or after it. Once we open the proverbial floor up for Q&A, I'll read those questions to Larry and give him a chance to answer them. So without further digital ado, I will turn myself off and let Larry take the screen.
Well, good evening. I hope Hollywood's watching this. I've been teaching for 31 years and I am programmed 55 minutes. So I have too many slides and not enough time. So I'm going to kind of jump right in and get started. I would like to just maybe start out by saying that I never dreamed that I would ever be a photographer. I never dreamed that I would be an artist. Growing up, that was not one of those that you could check, what do you want to do when you grow up? What I did is I checked a box one time that said architect because somebody told me that architects design buildings. Now, that's kind of cool. I'm going to do that and know that it also involved stress, structure, electricity, all those kinds of things. But in the architecture curriculum, they had a requirement that you take some drawing classes. This is kind of pre-computer, so you had to be able to render your ideas. And as soon as I picked up a pencil and paper and a paintbrush, I was hooked. And I switched, and my undergraduate was in sculpture, and I bought a camera when I was a senior to document my sculptures, because most of them were things that I wasn't really going to be able to carry around with me. And that camera was what changed my life. Photographs, it's like, I love this. So it was 4 years out of undergrad. I didn't do any more sculptures, but I kept taking photographs. So finally I applied to go to graduate school in photography. So that was in 1973. So that's kind of where I'm going to start here. So my first thoughts about, since I've never had a photography class, I thought it really was more about going out and finding interesting things to take pictures of. And that certainly can be a part of it, but it's a lot more than that, I discovered. But that was my first year. I just, took pictures of absolutely everything that I would see. If it looked interesting or weird, I was driving down the highway. I see this guy standing out in his yard with a chicken on his head. You see things like this. Well, you don't see this every day. You see things like this kind of every day. And you might think, that's weird. And you drive on. But with the camera, all of a sudden I had an opportunity to say, oh, I'm going to just make a U-turn and go back and ask that man if I can take a picture of him. And he was flattered, and his little daughter came out and was like, take a picture of me, take a picture of me. And I was saying, like, no, I want to take a picture of your dad. And finally, at the very end, I said, okay, you get in here too. And of course, that was the one that I ended up liking the best. So things I learned that first year. First of all, I started discovering right away that seeing with the camera is pretty different than seeing with your eye. And one of the things is that the eye is incapable of seeing infinite detail all at once. When you take a photograph, that camera is able to record every leaf on the tree, every person in a scene, every gesture equally all at the same time. So I was photographing things in a way that I really couldn't see. So like this was in New Orleans, and girls on a park bench. There's a photograph by Gary Winogrand, taken in Central Park of women on a park bench. And I was, oh, I'm going to do that photograph. And so I started photographing them, and they were just kind of like, oh, whatever. And it was afterwards that when I was going through my negative, that every one of these girls except one has her hand up to her face. And we've got all these girls and this one guy sitting a little bit separate, kind of saying, oh, what the heck's going on here with his hand? There's also the same number of pigeons as there are people. And I also started noticing how composition works, how this is, if you squint your eyes and don't look at the objects, the subject, and just you'll start seeing horizontal bands of lights and darks. And then kind of along the same lines, but I just had never really thought about it. We all have peripheral vision. The camera does not. So whenever you're taking a photograph, you are constantly deciding what's going to be in the frame of that camera and what's not. And by cutting this guy's head off and cutting this person's body off, all of a sudden there's a relationship between that hand and that horse. If I had included the guys riding the horse, if I'd included his head, it would have been a picture of a guy on a horse. And you would have been looking at his face like, okay, who is he? Why is he riding the horse? Or if you had gotten the rest of the person with their hand, it would have been about that person. But I'm creating a new relationship, something that I hadn't really ever noticed before. And another thing that I discovered was that we don't tend to see everything in depth at the same time. Our eye constantly shifts back and forth. So if we're standing at the edge of the Grand Canyon, we might be looking at the people on the overlook, and then our eye to the background, but we don't see them together at the same time. We're refocusing our eyes. The camera, if you use it a certain way, which great depth of field, all of a sudden the background and the foreground have a very distinct relationship to each other. And the essence of that is that it flattens the space out. It makes it seem almost much more two-dimensional than it actually, well, that's 17 miles away on the other side of the Grand Canyon. But it looks like it's a backdrop, especially with the young man over on my left-hand side. Looks like he's reaching out and touching the background. Well, I had the amazing good fortune. The summer, well, actually it would have been the spring of my first year in grad school, I was offered a change project that was called No Mountains in the Way. And Kansas Survey, the NEA stands for National Endowment for the Arts. And a man named Jim Inyard, who went on to be a very well-known photo historian, and he hired 2 photographers, and he himself was taking photos at the time. But the 3 of us went out and we documented the state of Kansas in 1974. And this was based on the work that was done during the Great Depression with the FSA, when the government hired photographers to go out and photograph the plight of farmers during that time period. And all that work went to the Library of Congress, so it became a national archive. And his argument was that that archive should be replenished every so many years, because anybody can go to the Library of Congress and go through every negative, every photograph that was taken by these photographers that the government hired. And we didn't have to give up our negatives, but we all made a set of prints that went to the Library of Congress, which eventually got transferred to the Smithsonian. The other photographer besides Jim Enyart and myself was Terry Evans, who spoke just a couple of weeks ago. And Terry and I became very good friends and still very good friends today. So if you're out there, Terry, hi. I loved your talk. Following on the heels of that was a book that Terry organized. And it was, as you can see here, it's called Kansas Album. And this was during the bicentennial year. And the Kansas Bankers Association put up the money for this, and they hired 8 photographers to basically, you had to work within the parameters of the state of Kansas, but you could photograph anything that you wanted to photograph. And it was just to make a record of what Kansas was like during the bicentennial. And I did a Google search, and everybody on this list, except for one person, I was able to find, and every one of those people is still doing photography, except for one person who is passed, but he was doing photography right up to the end. So this work was really important to all of us. And it really helped shape my vision for what I was going to do in the future. And I probably should back up and say, with the No Mountains in the Way, my first project, I'd been photographing things like guys with chickens on their heads and girls on park benches. And James Enyart, who had written the grant, assigned us subjects, and his was to do small town rural architecture. Terry Evans was given the job of photographing people, and I was to photograph the landscape. And I was not real happy about it. I really wanted Terry's job. I wanted to photograph people. But I give Jim Enyart credit for making me photograph something that was so common to me that I even thought of it was a worthy subject. But once I went out and I started, how do I take a picture of flat rural Kansas dirt and make it interesting? And I had to look a little closer, and I found out that I knew something that most people don't know, because I grew up on a farm and I spent my childhood driving a tractor, and I knew about crops, and I saw things in there that other people didn't, and I started seeing a beauty that I hadn't ever really realized that I knew about. This is from the Kansas album. So after Kansas album, I thought that I probably would go back and start photographing people again. But what I found out was that I had fallen in love with the landscape, and fallen in love particularly with the Kansas landscape, which some people describe as boring. I describe it as subtle. You have to look, but there are some amazing things out there. And the way that I could define the landscape, I don't have beautiful mountains and great vistas, but I generally have a flat horizon line. I've got some hills on this one, but it's the textures and it's the patterns and it's the plants that grow there. And how can you look at those and arrange them in such a way that it wants you to look even deeper. And even something as ordinary as, this is a field that they're working. It looks like they've been disking it. So the triangle that you see there is where the farm implement, the farmer's been turning corners and he hasn't gotten to that little piece. He's cut it off. And he'll go back and get that. But that makes such a beautiful shape right there. It's almost like a sideways exclamation point. And also something else that I had learned along the way, I didn't put an example of it in, but one of those duh moments is when I discovered how absolutely important light is. Light and shadow, it's what defines space. It makes texture stand out. And here I've managed to get the shadow of a cloud right there on the horizon line. So it makes that beautiful black line that corresponds or that juxtaposed to the white shape in the foreground. And more of the same, soybeans. Well, then a big event happened in my life, and I ended up moving to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and deciding that I wanted to make my living being a photographer, not just making art, which I didn't see how I could make a living being an artist. So I became a commercial photographer, and I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, but that's why I moved to Milwaukee. Two things that were profoundly important to me when I moved there. One of them is I had never lived near a major art museum before. In Lawrence, I could go into Kansas City and I go to the Nelson Atkins, but it was almost always trip to Kansas City. So let's run to the museum and let's go do this and let's go have dinner and let's go to a movie, let's do whatever. But in Milwaukee, I lived just a few blocks from the art museum. I had a membership. Winters are really long. I'd go back. And for the first time, I started really looking at things that I'd studied in art history. I could write a little paragraph about Milton Avery on the right and how he flattened out space, and Mark Rothko on the left, who was really just about the power of color. Rothko in particular, I'd never really understood that you can stand in front of one of his paintings, which are pretty large, and if you just let yourself go, the pure color just it can bring joy. This one would probably bring joy. It'd make me warm in the winter time, or it can be really depressing and sad. And I never exactly did that to my photography, but it was something that was going to come back. And in my work that I was doing there, it took me several years to get where I knew how to do this, because I'd never had any training whatsoever in using this kind of equipment and doing advertising work, but I made it. But 90% of it was in color. And I'd never really been interested in color. I'd tried it a few times and I always thought that it got in the way of my photograph. It looked like somebody had thrown confetti on my beautiful black and white photograph. And it was a lot of it was because I didn't know how to control color and how to really think in color. Also, there's another aspect to that. If you look through the history of photography, you don't see a lot of color work prior to the 1970s. And that was because color tended to be very fugitive. And if you've looked at old snapshots, and family albums and things, a lot of times the color photographs have faded. They tend to be pink or kind of a yellowy color. And that happened with the work that I did when I was in graduate school. The colors, I still got some of those photographs, and the colors are just terrible now. But in the 80s, they started finally getting that chemistry down, so the color could be somewhat reliable. Somewhere in the around 2000, it got to where it got very stable, and now we have digital printers, which are even better. But at any rate, I was doing a lot of color work. And then I got an offer to come back to Kansas and teach photography. And it's a long story, it goes with this. I don't have time to tell it, but they were looking for someone that knew how to do commercial work and fine art. And they were finding one or the other, but not both. And so they called me up and asked if I'd be interested. And I said, God, I would love to teach. I always wanted to teach, but I didn't know if I could teach in Emporia. But some things happened, and I took the job, and it was absolutely the best thing that ever happened to me. But one of the things that I knew that I was going to have to do teaching was I was going to have to teach how to do color. And even in commercial work, when I was shooting color, I took everything to the lab and they did it for me. So I learned how to process color film. I learned how to make color prints in the dark room. It's not a real pleasant job, but this is one of the first color photographs I took. And so I was easing into color really slowly here because, as I said before, when I'd tried to do color for my artwork, I always found it very garish. So I was looking for things at first that were almost monochromatic. It's almost a black and white photograph, but it's not. This is a breakwater going into Lake Michigan. And I got a little bolder and I started photographing some of my plowed fields. This is a wheat field. The combine's gone over and cut the wheat and left these great patterns. This is actually in eastern Washington state, an area called the Palouse. Well, on that same trip, because I've been teaching 1 year, and my first year of teaching was mostly about learning how to teach, because I had done a little bit when I was in grad school, but it had been almost 10 years since I'd been out of school. And they gave me an art appreciation class, which I was totally unprepared for. So I was always reading one chapter ahead of the students so I could go in and act like I knew what I was doing. But summertime came along, and this is the first time I'd ever had a job where I got a significant amount of time off. So I spent that summer driving across the United States and photographing landscapes. And I'm driving through eastern Oregon state, and I see this strange cloud on the horizon, and I get closer and closer to it. And now I'm under it, and I realize that's not a cloud, that's smoke. But I'm pretty much in the middle of the desert here. And it ended up being a forest fire that was about 20 miles away. But when I drove under it, everything turned this amazing golden color. And I thought, I had noticed in my previous year in the springtime, the farmers around Emporia and the Flint Hills, there were a lot of fires there. And I had initially assumed that those were accidental, because where I grew up in western Kansas, if there was a fire, what you did is you got your gunny sacks and your buckets of water. Everybody started driving toward that, and we'd try to beat the flames out because they were almost never intentional. But I got to asking around, and I'd heard some rumors about it when I was there. And so I went back to Kansas. I said, okay, those fires that you guys did in the spring, what's that about? And I got the whole story. This is part of the tallgrass prairie ecosystem. And fires have been going on since the beginning of whenever tallgrass prairie was there. That tallgrass prairie ran from Texas to clear up into Canada. And the last significant area of land that is still native tallgrass prairie is the Flint Hills that run through Kansas. Well, they actually start down in Oklahoma and run through Kansas. And if you don't burn them, they go to scrub forest, mostly cedar trees. And you get a lot of invasive plant, besides trees, you get different kinds of weeds and things growing in it that you don't want. So the ranch of Native Americans, this is what this is from, learned to set these fires to, they did two things. They could drive the buffalo to a certain area by lighting a fire behind them, but also after this fire was through, then the grasses would come back up and they would be green and tender, and the bison would come back and graze there. And they were doing what nature did. They estimate that any given spot of land, the tall grass prairie, probably burned once every 7 years. Naturally, the Native Americans started doing it intentionally, and then when European settlers came in, they started doing it for much the same reason, except for not bison. Now we're talking about cattle. But if you burn the old grass off, the new grass comes up. You can get your cattle on it about a month earlier, and so you have a month longer feeding season. You get fatter cows, and you make more money. Well, I answer, and I was talking to, said, well, when does this happen? And he said, well, the traditional date is April 1st, but people around here kind of get a little bit of a jump on that, and they'll start as early as March 15th and burn in through the middle part of April. Sometimes if they don't have it all done, they can go as late into late April, but and he said, well, and they don't usually light up until late afternoon, because if you light a fire in the morning, you're not sure where the wind's going to be coming from at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So you want the weather pattern to kind of stabilize. So March 15th, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I drive out to the Flint Hills, and there's a fire. I thought, wow, that's easy. This was it, and I stayed there. First, what I was attracted to here were the patterns, the lines that are going, and very much like my plowed fields. And I was still out here at dusk, so this is probably 8 or 9 o'clock. I don't know if it's daylight savings time or not. And I was out there till somewhere close to 1 o'clock in the morning, and the fire just kept getting smaller and smaller because the humidity had come up and the fire was wicking the moisture up from the ground, and it just wasn't burning as fast. And it wasn't until later I discovered that you can't see it. I can barely see it, but my car is in that, just right there, but the edge of the fire, clear on the very, very right-hand side. So, but I was parked on the road. Well, I was hooked. I'd been out there for 8 hours photographing this one fire, and I was back the next day and I was photographing more fires and more fires. And at first I was doing it the way that I knew to fight, is you choose the part that you think is the most important to be rendered onto film or exposed onto film, and you expose for that. So the fire is pretty bright, so I'm able to set my camera somewhere probably a 30th of a second or a 15th or something. It pretty much stops the action. It's blurry, but you can definitely see its flames. But the little puffs of smoke, which are moving much more slowly, they're nice and sharp. And I was this fire, I was out there and I'm shooting on a tripod, and it just occurred to me, what would happen if instead of shooting it as fast as I can, I'm going to shoot it as slow as I can. So I'm going to make the aperture of my lens, it's called stopping it down. I'm going to make it as small as possible. And then I can leave the lens open for much longer. So instead of a 30th of a second, it can be 30 seconds. And that's what I got. That is the same fire. My angles changed a little bit. And I can remember, I remember at the time thinking, oh, this could be interesting. And when I developed the film, it was just one of those, like, I pulled it out of the water. It was like, oh my God. And I painted with light. And this completely changed the way that I was looking at fires. So I started, and I was hooked. I had about 1 month to photograph. That's as long as they burn. And I was out every day that I possibly could. If it wasn't terribly, terribly windy, or if it wasn't raining, I would go out and I would photograph fires, trying to get every aspect that I could. And I had an exhibition in Portland, Oregon. This would be 2 years later. I started in 1990. This project, by the way, I worked on this for 27 years total, until I finally decided that I had pretty much done all I could do with them. Anyway, I'm in Portland. This photograph, which is not one of my favorites anymore. I still like it fine, but I spent that summer, I spent part of it in Thailand, and I'd been talking to a young man there from Thailand at the gallery, and he said, well, how much did you learn about Buddhism? And I said, well, not a lot, but I saw, and so, well, you know about yin yang, don't you? I go, well, of course, everybody knows that. He goes, but that's what that photo is. And it was like, oh, it is. For everything in the world, there is an equal opposite. And without the fires, there wouldn't be rebirth. And that got me thinking about the spirituality of fire. Why? And I had always known that I've been really drawn to fires. And yeah, I go out and I spend 8 hours in a field photographing them. Why? They are pretty, yeah, but they're not that pretty. But there's certain, it kind of tugs at something deeper. And I got to thinking, fire is essential to civilization. It heats our homes, but it can burn down our homes. It's good and evil. It cooks our food, it can kill us. It's good and evil. And even in every religion that I've looked at, fire represents something. In Western Christian religion, Elijah is taken up to heaven in a chariot of fire, and Saint Michael is stamping out the devil at the gates of hell, which is fire. So it's heaven and hell. And with kind of armed with that knowledge, and I didn't go out and I was looking for spiritual photos, but I was thinking about them differently. So I kept photographing the fires. Mark Rothko, this could be a Mark Rothko painting. And what this is, the fire is actually behind me. I had parked my car down below the hill there, walked up and waiting on the fire to get to me. And it was really cold. And I turned around to see how far away the car was, thinking, should I go home, go back? And I saw that the fire behind me was lighting up the landscape for probably close to a mile back there. I started, well, one of the rules in photography is called the rule of thirds. And my theory on rules has always been rules are just mere suggestions. They're meant to be broken. So, and the other part of that rule is you never put the horizon line right in the middle. So I was shooting with a square format camera. The negative was square. So I would often divide my pictures exactly in half. That's first no-no. There's that one is too. This is a burn field. This is what it looks like right afterwards. Nothing but ash. And it's pretty magical. And you step on it and the ash just poof, it goes away and you see dirt. But that maybe if it's not too windy, it might be there for an hour or so. First puff of wind is all gone. Obviously at dusk. This is a cottonwood tree that was down in a creek, had caught on fire, and it was hollow, so it was burning from the inside out. And this is also a slow shutter speed, so you can see the sparks falling off the tree, and also the way that the clouds have movement in them. It reminds me of a painting by Pinkham Ryder, like a dark and stormy night. Since it usually lasts around a month, I almost always manage to get a full moon shot in there somewhere. This is what's called a fire whirl, and it's created by heat rising from the fire and air rushing in to take the place of the heat that's going up, and it starts vortexing around itself. This is, it only happens on still days. Windy, it doesn't happen. This is a thing that when you get into forest fires, this is what causes the infernos that sometimes end up killing people, because you cannot possibly outrun them. And in forest fires, they're huge. They can be hundreds of feet across instead of 3 feet across. In 2002, I saw an ad it's called a first book prize, and it had to be a documentary subject, and you could be published in books, but you couldn't have had a monograph, a book just on your work. But the juror was a guy named Robert Adams, who is a photographer and an intellectual who I had always admired so much. And I didn't think that my work was exactly documentary, and I didn't think I had any chance whatsoever of getting this prize, but I thought, this is my chance to get my work in front of Robert Adams. And well, I got my work in front of Robert Adams, and he chose it for the book. And this isn't the book. So I guess what the book did, I thought the book was in 2003, and I started photographing in 1990, so I've been doing it for 13 years. I thought I was done, but what it ended up doing, it ended up freeing me, so I didn't feel like I had to stick within the confines of tallgrass prairie. I could expand outside of that, and it also gave me more freedom to be more abstract, I think. This is sugarcane burning in Louisiana, and what they do there is they cut the sugar cane in such a way that it lies down in rows, and then they set the rows on fire and burn off. They call it trash. It's burning off the leaves, so just all that's left is the stalk. And this reminds me very much of a church painting of his battle scenes at sea. Very apocalyptic. This is a wheat stubble fire. Wheat stubble is an interesting fire because they can be so ferocious, because the stems of the wheat stalk are hollow. So there's more oxygen, and also when the wheat's ripe, the plant's essentially dead. So it's bone dry unless it's been raining. So when you see a fire like this coming at you, you take the photo and then you start running parallel to it. You couldn't possibly outrun it. So I always get the questions, is it dangerous? Yes, it could be if I fell and broke my leg, but I always had an exit strategy. I knew how to get out of it, knock on wood. I did always get out of it, but this was definitely an inferno. This night, it was too windy to be burning. People were doing it anyway, and there were actually two men that were killed. Their pickup stalled in one of these, and one of my favorites is probably one of the least dramatic in a way. This fire is a good half a mile away. I'm standing on one hill, it's on the next hill over. And no, it's so minimalist. It's like a little bit of calligraphy on a black lens. This one was taken at the Wichita State University Research Station. Okay, I'm shifting gears here. One of my big introductions to Wichita had to do with the Greensburg Tornado. My home is Greensburg. It's where I grew up. My family still lived there, and I got a call about 2 o'clock in the morning. I was living in Kansas City then, commuting to Emporia. Anyway, I got a call from my dad. He had gotten his flip phone and had driven south about 30 miles so he could get reception, and called me and told me that Greensburg was gone. It got blown away by a tornado. And I thought Dad was, I knew obviously had been hit by a tornado or he wouldn't be calling me, but always exaggerating. You know, it was probably a bad tornado, but no, Greensburg was gone. Now, my folks lived 6 miles out of town. They didn't even know it had happened themselves for a couple of hours until neighbors came and told them. So I immediately jumped in the car. I sort of muscle memory, I grabbed my camera and my camera bag and a couple changes of clothes, and I was on the road. I didn't go to photograph, I went to help people. And so we were working outside, and the National Guard had sealed the town off, and they wouldn't let anybody in because they were doing search and rescue. And I kept looking over. We were just like a half a mile south at that point, helping some farmers that had been hit. And about 3 in the afternoon, I just took my cameras, and instead of going up the road, I walked across a field and walked into town, and was able to spend about 3 hours there until I ran out of film, photographing the devastation before anybody else besides the National Guard had gotten in. So basically nothing was touched. This is the farmhouse we were working on. So what I like about this one is the way that that wall that's not there looks like it's a mural. It looks very flat and two-dimensional. This is what Matisse did with a lot of his paintings of, he'd have windows, but the windows look more like pictures hanging on a wall than it did like there's things outside of the window. Oops. Okay, this is a turning point. These white things up here, those are all binders of negatives, starting when I started doing color, 1988 through the Greensburg Tornado, 2007. So all those binders have sheets of negatives, which you see down over in the middle on the left-hand side. This is one of those opened up, and they're all dated and numbered. So it'll say, one says 98 dot, I can't read it what it says, but it'll be 42. Well, okay. And then what you do is you take those negatives and then you lay them down on a sheet of photo paper, and you shine light through them, and you get what's called a contact sheet, and that's on the bottom right-hand side. So that contact sheet that I'm seeing right there, it's 9467. So that's the 67th roll of film I took in 1994. And I can go back up here to my white binder. I can pull down 1994, 95, and I can pull out that particular roll of film. Over here on all these boxes, those are the contact sheets like what you're seeing. Today, starting in 2007, that was all shot, the tornado was all shot with film. In 2008, I started shooting digital. Everything I've done since 2008 fits on this portable hard drive that is 3 inches by 4 inches and weighs ounces, not hundreds of pounds like my negatives do. It's a very different world. I take photographs of everything all the time, but I love working on projects. And so I did this project. I'm going to just skip ahead because this is the one that was at the Wichita Art Museum, but it had to do with Kansas farmers and particularly the water use. I tried to cover both sides. People are saying you ecological bastards freeze to death in the dark, and I art ethanol. And I want to get to some that you may be less likely to see here.
Larry, I also just wanted to jump in quickly to say that it's 6:50, and I wanted to make sure that we also give people a chance to ask questions. So
Yeah.
just a quick.
Okay, I'll run through the portraits real fast. I'm doing a series of portraits, and I'm basing them loosely on paintings and photographs that I've admired. This guy's from Rotterdam, and this thing in his arm is a kite, and that's his camera he's holding in the other hand. It's based on a painting here of a Dutch nobleman with his flag and his sword. This is my niece Helen, based loosely on Rembrandt. My friend Larry, the tattoo man, based loosely on a Cramibolo, who did people out of vegetables and fruits. Many of you know this lady, and based on a photograph of Pablo Picasso, taken by Arnold Newman. And what I'm doing right now, lately I've been doing some work on isolation with the pandemic. Boom, boom. This is not a door. At the end, we get tired. Okay, I'm ready for that. Let's see.
So I just want to invite anybody who has questions to jump in, to use the Q&A box and take advantage of this opportunity to ask Larry questions. Right now, I'm not seeing any. I guess I'll hopefully we're waiting for folks to join us. Will you talk a little bit more about your experience of the pandemic and this work that you've been doing around isolation, solitude?
Sure. It's not a set project, but I have been sequestered like everybody else has, so I haven't been out as much. But when I do go though, I find the emptiness really fascinating. It's kind of like I'm in a world I don't know. And what started it all was really that first one I showed. All the picnic tables that were wrapped in that barrier plastic, and there was a sign on top of each one of them saying Governor Kelly has ordered that, you know, that all. And a number of those photographs that you saw are ones that I had taken before, but I went back, and I'm kind of a loner when I photograph. It's something of all my earlier landscapes and fires. There's never a person in them. I'll wait for somebody to leave before I photograph. And so I felt that was, I guess, just symbolic of the times. We're all alone here. And we have a question.
We do. We actually have a couple. So Meryl Gerhardt. Hi, Meryl. That's my mother-in-law. is asking, can you say something about the techniques that you used in post-processing, particularly the striking portraits?
With very few exceptions, I know Photoshop really well, and I can do things with you know, the fool the eye things, but I really try my very hardest to take the photograph right in the first place. So what I do in post-processing is I will correct something you do in the dark room is dodging and burning. And the way that worked, if you wanted something lighter, you held off light on a certain area of the photograph when the enlarger's turned on. And if you wanted it darker, you blocked everything off except that area. And the tools in Photoshop are called dodge and burn tools, exactly, the old-fashioned name for what they represent. So mostly I don't do a lot there. My artwork, I'm very particular about. I need to be able to record it the way that I see it as closely as possible. I won't say that I've never done, taken out a stray piece of a newspaper in the foreground or something like that. But mostly with the portraits, so the question was, it's just dodging and burning and color correcting.
And so related to the portraits, Patricia McDonald asks, and I had the same question, what inspired your decision to make a large shift from landscape to the portrait work? Seems like quite a huge leap.
Well, what actually made me want to do it was that I bought a very expensive, I was going to use it as a landscape camera, but it turned out to be too awkward to use, but I had to justify the expense. But I also thought this was a way that I could incorporate my knowledge of studio light earned when I was a commercial photographer into my own artwork. I also was making a huge nod towards, when I go to art museums, I invariably spend much more time with paintings than I do photography. And I personally find it sort of flat. People say, "Oh, I really love your paintings. I mean, your photographs." So I feel like what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to paint with the camera. And also, another aspect of it was that I was looking at the face as a landscape, and even with lighting, which I don't like the landscapes, obviously, but you wait for that special time when the light's really low, so you pick out certain kinds of textures and contours. I do the same thing with light in the studio.
Was it a new skill set that you had to acquire in terms of talking to your models, interacting with them in a way that you wouldn't with?
It was a new skill set, but it was also very natural. I really enjoy doing that. Now, when I did commercial work, sometimes I would take a photograph and, so like I'd say I'm doing an annual report, and you go in and you take a photograph of the CEO of some company. They say, you have 15 minutes. So you have to go in and you bang, 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 as fast as you can. And those photographs they were always happy. Well, they weren't always happy with them, but they're mostly happy with them. And what I found with my portraits, I'll spend an hour, sometimes 2 hours. We really get to know each other. People I didn't know very well. The last photograph I showed was Tom Otterness. And I've met Tom a number of times, but I've never spent 2 hours with him, just he and I talking, and he became more and more relaxed, and it was great. Do it just for the conversation.
I guess there's kind of a parody there that you also spend a lot of time with a landscape, right? Probably as you photograph it. You don't just show up, shoot it, and leave. The way you were describing it, right? You kind of stake it out in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and sometimes I'll come back to the same one, and just when the light's a little different. But yes, and I shoot it from all different angles. The thing I like about digital too is that it gives me, and I was never stingy with film, but when you're photographing with film, and especially being 2 1/4, which I was, it was somewhere close to 75 cents to $1 every time you click the shutter. So you're a little more judicious about what you were taking photo of. With digital, I I can shoot as many as I want. I don't ever set it automatic and do that, that motor drive thing. But I can try on angles that I might not otherwise.
So related to the angles you might not try otherwise, Donald Rogus, hi Donald, is asking, have you viewed any of the urban decay photography, or I guess, aside from maybe the Greensburg project, has that been an interest to you?
Yes, I've seen a lot of it, and I have not photographed urban decay, but I've photographed small town decay. I've got a whole series. I could have started showing those, but so many of the small towns in Western Kansas are dying, and there's empty storefronts, abandoned houses. We were somewhere early spring, I think in February, we went to a small town, and actually it was southeastern Kansas. There was not one building there that wasn't in some sort of state of decay, and people were living there. But at first you would think this looks like it's a ghost town. So yeah, I there's a certain beauty about it, and there's also definitely a major sadness about it.
So related to that, Judy Natal has kind of a meta question about what keeps you still so fascinated with photography. Is it habit or just a wondrous curiosity about the world or something else?
Well, way back in early grad school, when I was first starting to read other people's thoughts about photography, and one of the people that I most admired was Gary Winogrand, who was sort of notorious for not saying much about anything.
Really funny to watch his interviews. Yeah.
One of the things he said was, I'm going to paraphrase it slightly, but very, very close to it. I photograph things to see what things look like photographed. And I'm not supposed, how am I supposed to learn anything from that? But it's so true. I mean, and when I was kind of going back earlier, it's taught me to look much more acutely. I'm constantly looking at qualities of light, and I now find myself lining things up, moving over to the side just to see what happens if my computer screen covers the light a little bit that way. My powers of observation have gotten so much better, and it's actually particularly good at it, but it's even made me a better drawer and painter.
Mm-hmm. Do you still sculpt?
Pardon?
Do you still sculpt? That's one of the questions in our Q&A.
Mostly for myself, but yeah.
Okay. So I think there are two questions are essentially asking the same thing. So the people are clearly clamoring for an answer to this question, and it's a good one to end on. Do you have a favorite project or body of work attached to or proud of?
Well, all of them.
Do you love any of your children more than others?
Well, the fires I did for over 20 years, and the fires definitely brought me the most notoriety. The collections itself, I think every one of those owns fire photos, and so I have to say I'm proudest of that. I won't say it. I'm proud of the other work too, and I think okay, I know that one of the reasons the fires did as well as they did is that up until that time, nobody had ever really dealt with that as from an artistic standpoint. There were documents of prairie burning. This is why we do it, but nobody had looked at it in terms of the abstract qualities. So that was kind of new territory. And I think it also touched on what I was saying earlier about, it kind of touches on our unconsciousness and even fire as a photo. I mean, we have a fireplace on. If there's a fire in the fireplace, people just sit there and stare at it. A candle on the table, people stare at the candle flame. We're fascinated by fire. So I took that fascination and I somehow recorded it in such a way that I think people can relate to it. I really love the farmer series that I did, because that's so much a part of who I am as a person. I grew up on a farm. I know those people, and I've become somewhat of a lay expert on prairie burning because I've been around people doing it enough. But that wasn't my childhood. I never knew about prairie burning until I was 30 years old.
Was it ever to negotiate, like photographing farms and farmers and kind of then maybe showing that work in an art world context where people may not be as intimately familiar with that world as you are?
Not really. When I was photographing, if there's anybody involved, I always took some nice flattering pictures of them, like what they'd expect. And I would always send them some, or I usually sent them some. And then I would take the photos for myself. And as far as getting permission to photograph things, well, first, I'm pretty bad about not asking permission. If I don't see somebody around, but if somebody's there, I'll go over and say, do you mind? And one time in all those years of doing fires, somebody say to me, I just assumed you weren't here, son. Instead of get the hell off my land, I just assumed you weren't here. It's a very polite farmer way of saying get the hell off. And some people would, well, quite a few would stop and say, well, be careful, you know what you're doing. And I always say, I've been doing this a long time, and they say, okay, as long as you're careful, I don't want to get sued. But they're proud of their land. And on the farmer project, I had a man out in Colby that I'd gotten a connection with, and I'd called him ahead of time, and he took me around to take photos. I mean, things, and he'd take me places, and I'd take some photos, and then I'd say, wait, stop, and I'd jump out and I'd take a lot of photos. At the end of the day, he says, everything I was interested in, you weren't. Everything that you took photographs, I never thought about taking photos of before. But he was good spirited about it. But so it was just a different way of looking at things. He was thinking I was like a big city tourist and wanted to see what a farm was like, kind of showing me the best of the best. And
I see. And there you were looking at the weird.
Yeah.
Well, I, for one, am very appreciative of that work. It was one of the first things that I think I saw at WEM after we moved to Wichita, and it was full early introduction for me as somebody who is still fairly new to Kansas to this landscape. And I think it's both beautiful and kind of conceptually very compelling work. So I want to be respectful of everybody's time. We're a few minutes over our usual 7 o'clock stopping time. So I want to say a big thank you, Larry, for joining us and for sharing your thoughts and work with us. And if anybody is curious to see it again later, it will be on our YouTube channel where the entire archive of these Ulrich virtual programs resides. So thank you. This was great.
Thank you, Larry. It was just wonderful.
Thank you.
I'm partial to that picture of Lake Michigan, I must say.
Go. Are we done?
All right, everyone.
We are. Thank you so much, Larry.
See ya.
We'll see you soon.
Thank you.